Good morning and welcome to today's press conference with Senator Paula Simons and Senator Robert Black. We'll start with some opening statements, then we'll move on to the questions period. As usual, one question, one follow-up. Nous allons prendre les questions dans la salle et ensuite nous irons sur Zoom. Senators, the floor is yours.
Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us. My name is Senator Robert Black and I'm chair of the Senate Committee on Agriculture and Forestry. And I'm joined today by my colleague, Senator Paula Simons, Deputy Chair of the committee. Today, the Agriculture and Forestry Committee is releasing its report on the floods that devastated British Columbia's Fraser Valley in November 2021. I'll begin with an overview of the committee's study and a summary of the key facts and findings, and then speak to the first of the report's 3 recommendations. Senator Simons will discuss more key findings and witness testimony related to the report's 2nd and 3rd recommendations. We will then be pleased to take your questions. The committee launched its study on the BC floods in April of 2022. We focused on investigating the effects of the floods, as well as the flood response and recovery efforts. 23 witnesses testified before the committee, including BC agricultural trade associations, Indigenous leaders, hydraulic engineering consultants, climate scientists, and federal and municipal officials. Here's what we heard. The 2021 BC floods were caused by an intense flow of water vapor in the atmosphere, known as an atmospheric river. This produced heavy rainfalls and swollen rivers in southwestern British Columbia and parts of neighboring Washington state. The Nooksack River in northern Washington breached its banks. The floodwater rushed towards Abbotsford, BC. Damage to the agriculture sector and infrastructure in the Fraser Valley region was widespread and costly. According to Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, the floods inundated more than 15,000 hectares of land and affected more than 1,000 farms and 2.5 million livestock. Officials estimate that the cost to farmers alone, including dairy, pork, chicken, hatching egg, and blueberry producers, was well over $250 million. The floods also closed highways, logging roads, and railway tracks. Residents in the flood zone had trouble leaving. Agriculture and forestry producers couldn't get their goods to market because of their access to the Port of Vancouver was cut off. This disrupted supply chains. The scale of the damage and witness testimony for our study have highlighted many vulnerabilities in BC's flood mitigation infrastructure. As it stands, large part of the Sumas Prairie near Abbotsford are inherently vulnerable to flooding because they're located on a drained lake bed. And yet the committee learned that most of the dikes built to prevent flooding in the Lower Mainland no longer meet provincial standards, and upgrades have not been prioritized. A study conducted by the BC government in 2015 concluded that 87% of the dikes were in less than fair condition. 71% were expected to fail simply by overtopping in the event of a flood. Let those numbers sink in. At the rate that Canada is warming, we know major floods will reoccur, and the damage they cause could be much worse. The committee heard that if the Fraser River overflowed its banks, the resulting damage would be at least 10 times greater than that of the 2021 floods. The fact that communities are not properly protected is deeply troubling. We heard loud and clear, BC farmers want to see more urgency placed on infrastructure upgrades. Unfortunately, dike and pump station upgrades would cost several $billions, and municipalities cannot afford that cost on their own. Knowing this, the federal government must play a role in helping the BC government update the province's outdated flood infrastructure to protect Fraser Valley residents, farmers, and their livelihoods. That's why the report's first recommendation calls on the Government of Canada to develop a comprehensive plan for flood control in the Fraser Valley, in collaboration with the BC government, municipalities, and First Nations. This plan should include a timeline for dike upgrades, as well as the establishment of a committee to examine flood mitigation measures, emergency preparedness, and response strategies. There needs to be close collaboration across all levels of government to reduce Canadians' vulnerability to flooding events and to align the collective response when they do occur. With that, I'll turn the microphone over to Senator Simons.
Thank you so much, Senator Black. I'll first address our examination of the federal and provincial responses to the 2021 BC floods. Je tiens à vous partager que plus de 14 000 résidents de la Colombie-Britannique ont quitté la région pendant ce terrible événement. The committee invited representatives from several BC agricultural associations to testify about the government programs that farmers turned to for help in the aftermath of the disaster. We heard those programs were helpful, but far from perfect. Key existing programs include the Agri-Stability, Agri-Insurance, and Agri-Recovery funds. These are run by Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada in concert with the province. The Agri-Stability Program helps Canadian farmers cover and manage large declines in their total farm income. The Agri-Insurance Program alleviates the financial impact of crop losses due to natural disasters. And Agri-Recovery is a disaster relief framework to help agricultural producers recover from such disasters. After the 2021 floods, the federal and BC governments also launched a joint flood recovery program for food security. That program provides one-time funding for infrastructure repair and cleanup costs not covered by insurance. It also funds return to production expenses. Additionally, Farm Credit Canada, a Crown corporation and the country's largest agricultural term lender, launched a program that offers loan payment deferrals to affected farmers and food processors. Now, our witnesses recognize the important role these programs played in supporting farmers and producers affected by the floods, but they also flagged challenges with how that aid was delivered. 6 months after the floods, 6 months, the president of the BC Pork Producers Association said that many of his members still hadn't received some of the financial support they'd been promised by both levels of government. One of those people was Johnny Gulliker, a pig farmer from the Sumas Flats. In his words, his farm got, quote, pretty well wiped out during the floods. His dikes failed, and all his sows were drowned. In May 2020, he said he was still waiting for relief funding. Les présidents des associations agricoles nous ont dit que ce fonds doivent être versés plus rapidement dans les circonstances d'urgence. Ils nous ont aussi parlé de défis administratifs auxquels ils doivent faire face quand ils font une demande de financement. They also flagged administrative challenges that producers faced when applying for funding. Some of those issues were later addressed, but in the moment, they only worsened the emotional and mental stress that applicants were already feeling. There is no time for red tape in the immediate aftermath of catastrophic flooding. That's why the report's second recommendation calls on the federal government to ensure that its agricultural and disaster relief programs have enough financial and human resources, so people and businesses reeling from natural disasters can access that aid quickly and easily. To conclude, I will outline the need for more cooperation between Canada and the United States on the management of lake and river basins in the two countries. As Senator Black explained, the BC floods happened after significant rainfall caused the Nooksack River in Washington to overflow and rush over the border into Sumas Prairie. Heavy flooding from the Nooksack is not a new event. In addition to last year, the river flooded and badly in 1990, 1995, and in 2006. This is a long-standing issue that residents, First Nations, and governments have been concerned about for many years. Le comité est d'avis que si rien ne change, de telles catastrophes vont se reproduire. It's essential that Canadian and U.S. officials work together on measures to manage transboundary waters like the Nooksack River and limit the impact of future flooding events. During his testimony, the mayor of the city of Sumas in Washington state suggested that a variety of solutions will be needed. While the committee is very grateful to Mayor Bruce Bosch for testifying in our study, we were disappointed that the state of Washington did not participate and offer further insights. The situation can only improve if there is true cooperation among all jurisdictions and in both countries. And so, our report's third and final recommendation is that the Government of Canada and the Government of the United States engage in discussions about the management of transboundary waters, including but not limited to the Nooksack River. Other governments in the two countries should also be involved in those discussions as required. The committee is encouraged that British Columbia and Washington State have agreed to work together to build on a new flooding prevention plan and response for the Nooksack River as part of ongoing bilateral initiatives. But, as the governor of Washington said earlier this year, the challenge of flooding is, quote, bigger and more urgent than any one level of government can solve on its own. Je vous remercie de votre attention. Nous allons maintenant répondre à vos questions. We'll be happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Senators. Nous allons maintenant commencer avec la période de questions. I invite everybody on Zoom who has a question to use the raise hand function. We'll start in the room with Jan Bailey, Globe and Mail.
In summary, for either or both of you, what would you say your release here begins with a call for the federal government to work with BC and local municipalities to develop a comprehensive plan for flood control. In summary, how would you characterize the work that is being done or has been done or is done today on this issue, given the likelihood of further flooding at some point in the future?
I can start off by saying that we heard that some work has been done, but not enough and not quickly enough in the event of another flood, of another critical incident. So certainly we heard that some work has been done. There's been some studies, but it's not being prioritized and not being done quick enough.
And these things are always complicated because you're dealing with two countries, two states, various municipal governments, and First Nations. So it's not going to be an easy fix. But I think the disaster of last November is a very sharp and forceful reminder that we have to, make our diplomacy as efficient as possible in this area, because this is something that not one order of government and not one country can solve.
Follow up, what level of risk do you think that region of British Columbia is facing from further similar catastrophic flooding? And as to squeeze in a second question there, what can other parts of Canada learn from this situation, if anything? What lessons should other parts of this country take?
We'll split that.
Yeah, I can start off with the first one. I can start off with the first one. I think the risk is high. We heard that if the Fraser Valley was flooded, the damages would be tenfold. So and we know that climate change is impacting us significantly. And so as we move forward, I believe the risk is high, and we need to prioritize this. Our various levels of government need to look at this and appropriately.
In terms of what other regions of the country can learn, I think it's vital that we understand that we need to have resilient infrastructure across the country, because different parts of the country will face different kinds of risks. I mean, certainly Atlantic provinces could probably learn most directly from what happened in British Columbia because of the risk of these atmospheric rivers moving from offshore into the mainland. I mean, I understand that there's an atmospheric river in the forecast for British Columbia again today and tomorrow. We'll have to hope that it's not nearly as severe. But I'm also privileged to serve on the Senate Standing Committee on Transportation and Communications, and we recently embarked on what's going to be a long-term study about the climate resiliency of all of our transportation infrastructure, because that was really severely, I'm a senator from Alberta, and so, one of the reasons I pushed hard for this study is that as an Albertan, I could see what was happening in neighboring British Columbia, but there was also this terrible sense of being cut off, because we'll remember that rail lines failed and roads failed, and we need to have a serious and coordinated look at how we prepare for the climate change, not just to come, but that is happening right now in real time.
I will further add that the committee did take it to heart that, what we were studying in this study, we asked the questions about how might we learn from this in a broader sense. And that discussion happened a great deal.
Next question will be on Zoom. Doug Ferguson.
Hi there. The report talks about a national adaptation strategy that's currently being undertaken. Do you have much details about that and how it applies to this, the question you just answered about agriculture and the lessons that could be broadly learned from what happened in BC last year?
I'm sorry, Doug, I don't have much to add to that. It's something that we likely need to look into further. I apologize.
I think, we're the Agriculture Committee, the Agriculture and Forestry Committee, so we looked primarily at the impact of the flooding on the agricultural and latterly the forestry economy of British Columbia. But I don't think there's a micro-region of the country that is not vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, and I don't think there's an industry that's not vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. The challenge is to integrate our understanding of those risks across the country and across economic sectors so that we have a coordinated and coherent response.
Doug, do you have a follow-up?
Yes. So what do you think needs to happen in terms like financial mitigation? You talked about the 6-month delay in BC. What do you think should happen in terms of like possibly boosting the programs like financially and also improving the administrative turnaround?
We did hear definitively that there were problems with the turnaround time of many of those programs. And so part of our recommendation, part of the report speaks to that very fact. And so we would encourage program providers, governments to think carefully about how quickly those programming funds and supports can be provided. We did hear, as Senator Simons mentioned, that 6 months later, there were pork farmers that were still struggling. They had not received their funds. That's unfortunate, and that should not be the case.
Now, we all know, this happened in the midst of the pandemic at a time when, it still seems we don't have enough workers to do the jobs required, throughout government and throughout economic sectors. And so I sympathize with the relief agencies that were trying to get the money out, but it's clear we need to have a more coordinated response because these disasters are going to keep happening. And I think we also have to make applications as frictionless as possible. The fewer numbers of forms you have to fill out, the more easily you can fill them out online. There are ways that can reduce the number of man hours for both farmers and government workers to get those funds to people as quickly as possible.
Next question is Lindsay Campbell, iPolitics.
Hi there. I know that you spoke, Senator Simons, to the impact of certain farmers not getting their funding in time. I'm wondering if you could maybe speak a little bit more to that. Did you hear any cases of producers going out of business as a result of this?
I don't think any of our witnesses were in a position where they were going out of business. I think anecdotally, they spoke of people who were at risk of going out of business. Certainly, waiting 6 months, if you're, it's a bit like being in the hospital emergency room when you're waiting on the outside instead of the inside. If you know for certain that the money is coming, you can have some peace of mind. And even if you have to wait for it, you can arrange with your creditors, you can arrange with your workers, that the money will come. I think it's being in limbo that is the most frightening and frustrating for people when they don't know for certain that help is on the way. So, it seems from what we heard that farmers in the Fraser Valley have been remarkably resilient, that farm communities have come together to help one another, that people, were able to, say, get the blueberry crop off this year without too much difficulty. But I think that as bad as this was, it's a wake-up call for something that could be much worse later on.
Mm-hmm. And do you have a sense of how much ballpark financially was held up over that 6-month period?
I don't know that we have a total.
Yeah, I don't recall us hearing a total of what was held up. We anecdotally, as you mentioned, we heard that there were concerns, folks that weren't receiving their monies. I don't recall us hearing a number. Sorry, Lindsay.
You know,
Okay, thank you.
I can give you some, if you look on pages 10 through 12 of the report, there are a lot of numbers that detail, you know, the estimate of flood-related damages for farmers was $285 million. Damages for dairy farmers alone totaled between 22 million and $100 million. So, you know, these are pretty high numbers. You know, we were able to break out some other things. For example, Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada officials told us that agri-insurance payments to farmers for crops that were not yet harvested when the BC floods occurred. So these are crops that had grown over the summer and were waiting for late fall harvest, totaled almost $300,000. $200,000 plus for carrots, $90,000 for potatoes, you know, a loss of $1.1 million in blueberry production, and just over $750,000 for the loss of flower bulbs. I think it's important to note that this is one of the most fertile areas of the country. It's hugely important, not just to British Columbia's economy, but to our entire food supply chain.
But with the numbers, with the monies held up over time, we did not get that number.
Are there any other questions in the room?
Is there any cost for a comprehensive plan for flood control in the Fraser Valley? Like, what are you thinking in terms of the cost for following through on this? And what would you say you consider that cost?
We heard billions. We didn't get a number. We heard billions.
You know,
Because of some of the dikes have to be moved, not just rebuilt or built higher. They need to be moved, and other work around that. So we heard billions. I think if it doesn't happen in a timely fashion, in some respect, we're in for, we'll see this happen again and again and again.
You know, and this is sort of a penny wise, pound foolish argument here. I mean, you need to invest the money to maintain the infrastructure, or the costs are much greater down the road. I mean, I just want to reiterate the numbers that Senator Black mentioned off the top, that 87% of dikes in the Lower Mainland are in less than fair condition, and 71% of dikes are expected to fail just, you know, when the water gets too high, which is presumably the point of the dike in the first place. So, you know, I remember when the witness who spoke gave us that information, the silence in the room. It was Monica Mannerstrom, who's a hydraulic engineer. And, you know, to be told that 70–80% of the dikes are not going to be equipped to do the job required of them is a pretty sobering realization. And I mean, you know, Senate reports, we hope that this does not sit on a shelf and gather dust. This was an unusual report for us because oftentimes Senate reports are months, if not years, in the making. We did this as a kind of emergency spot study. So we heard from a relatively small number of witnesses, and we got the report out in what for Senate time was very, very quickly. We wanted to have it out before the first anniversary of the floods, and we were able to do that. But, you know, we want people to pay attention, not just, you know, the ladies and gentlemen of the press who are here, but we are hoping that that government ministers will respond to this report in a timely fashion.
And the cost of this 50/50 federal provincial, who has to, how do you see splitting the cost?
I would say that that's yet to be determined. We certainly heard from municipalities who said that they couldn't afford it on their own. They were looking for provincial and federal support to undertake these upgrades.
Yeah, so I think, I mean, we're looking at tripartite responses because the municipalities are the first government on the ground dealing with you know, the nitty gritty of this with their elbows up. So municipalities absolutely have to be part of this discussion. It's not just a federal provincial thing. And First Nations, we also heard from some really compelling Indigenous witnesses who spoke to us about the importance of their inclusion in any of these discussions, because they are also facing the brunt of this if such a disaster reoccurs.
The First Nations chief that we heard from emphasized that federal and provincial policy and funding need to be aligned and to receive, and so that they can receive the support they require on the ground. I don't know what he's doing, but.
Do we have any other question on Zoom? Doug Ferguson, please go ahead.
Yeah, I guess if you tell me about this report, is it mostly advise government? Like, does anyone, like, what will be its fate, basically, do you think?
Well, as Senator Simon said, we hope it doesn't sit on a shelf. There are 3 recommendations that have been put forward, so it's not a lengthy report by any means. It's our hope that that the federal government will respond to our report in a timely fashion, and we will be asking for that response, and hopefully taking the recommendations that have been provided under advice.
I have to say, I'm still a relatively new senator, although I'm not that much newer than Senator Black. So this is the first report I've been part of. We are asking for a response, not just from the Minister of Agriculture, but also from the Ministers of Infrastructure and Communities, Transportation, and the Environment, because this is obviously something that crosses jurisdictional boundaries within Cabinet. So, you know, perhaps because I've only been a senator for 4 years, I remain hopeful that we will have a response to this report, which, as I say, we endeavored to research and write in a very timely fashion, so that, you know, less than 12 months after the disaster, we're hoping that this can be a useful document, not just to the federal government, but to municipal leaders in British Columbia who really came to us looking for support for their issues.
Doug, do you have a follow-up?
Yeah, have you had a chance to give any federal or provincial or municipal officials an early draft of this, or have you gotten any feedback yet?
It was not provided ahead of time to any of them, and so we haven't heard any feedback.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. This concludes the press conference then. Merci. Thank you, Senators.
Merci.
Merci.